Welcome to Real GM Radio here at CLNS. I'm Wes Goldberg. The NBA season got started this week, but not really for the Philadelphia 76ers. We're going to talk with Kyle Neubeck from PHLY Sports about what's going on with them. Then Keith Smith will join us to talk about some of these more interesting rookie scale contract extensions that were signed earlier in the week. Let's jump in. Kyle Neubeck, who covers the 76ers for PHLY Sports, is here. We're recording this the morning after the Sixers opening night loss to the Milwaukee Bucks. No Joel Embiid or Paul George in that one. We'll talk about that game here in a second, but I do want to start with Joel Embiid. ESPN reported that the NBA is launching an investigation into the Sixers for how they are handling Joel Embiid's maintenance program. What do you make of the league's investigation, and were the Sixers wrong to kind of just be so open about it?
Well, so one, from talking to people, it does seem like this is sort of an automatic these new rules they have for player participation. There will be an investigation if a star player misses a national TV game. Right now, the circumstances are a little different in this instance because Joel Embiid basically outright said in an interview with ESPN in the last month, hey, I don't think I'm playing back-to-backs ever again. And once you effectively telegraph that, like, not just months, but maybe years from now, yeah, I'm just not playing in that game. And that has all those downstream effects for TV, selling tickets, et cetera, that becomes a sort of a different problem for the league. My guess would still be, end of the day, common sense probably prevails, and the league looks at it and, maybe they fine the Sixers, but it's still a situation where this is a guy with a long and checkered health history who has never been healthy in the playoffs, who played in the Olympics and has never played, high competitive basketball in August, this close to, the lead up to training camp, preseason, start of the regular season. I think ultimately common sense prevails there, but what does that actually look like, and how strict do they want to be here with this specific player when, by all accounts, what the Sixers are trying to say is there hasn't been a setback. He's not actually injured. We're just getting him ready. And it's like, well, it's a little different when, in Kawhi's case, for example, Kawhi, they're saying, he's dealing with swelling and he's got this, like there's an identifiable problem. And I think it's a little murkier with Embiid. So I'm very curious to see where the league eventually falls on it.
Yeah, the NBA just doesn't want to be embarrassed, right?
Of course.
There's a line that you can cross, and I actually thought for most of what Joel Embiid was doing in media day, the preseason, all that stuff, I thought he was towing the line really well, saying all the right things. I'm losing the weight. I'm more about like maintaining my body, making sure I'm fresh for the playoffs, all these things. It didn't take a whole lot of reading in between the lines to be like, this guy's probably not playing every single back-to-back. He didn't have to come out and just say it outright. I understand that, Joel Embiid is out there. He's very available to the media, and it's like he's going to say something wrong, and it's like, man, we got so close. And he kind of just put his foot in his mouth a little bit, and now it launches that investigation. You have Daryl Morey out here maybe trying to, hey, maybe that was a little bit overblown. That's not necessarily the case, perhaps. But, yeah, I understand where the NBA is coming from. But if he really isn't going to play back-to-backs, like, that part is interesting to me because Philadelphia has 15 back-to-backs this year. Joel Embiid has already been basically ruled out for the first 3 games of the year. They said they're going to reevaluate him in a week. So 15 plus 3, that's 18 missed games already. Out of 82, you're already down to 64 games if you play all the other games, which he probably isn't going to do. And so you're already not meeting that 65-game threshold. So that's really the tough thing here is, okay, no back-to-backs. You're already out for the first week with like this, like you were already talking about, not really an injury, just sort of this maintenance thing already. It's like, how many games are you really going to play here,
Yeah, so we did some over-unders on our show prior to the season, and we set the line at 58 games, and I took the under. I think if he gets to 60 games, I think that's a win. That's the exact number that Kawhi Leonard got to in 2018-19 in Toronto. It's the season that I think they're sort of using as a model for how they want to handle Joel. And, it to your point, it won't just be back-to-backs. There will be times when, maybe it's just a strenuous part of the year. Maybe he's not feeling right. And they'll say, okay, well, night off, 2 nights off, excuse me, whatever it needs to be in order to keep him at as close to 100% as they can all throughout the year. And so that puts a really big focus on, you got to keep Paul George healthy, because I think what you saw in the opener against Milwaukee on Wednesday is that while Tyrese Maxey is very good, when you ask him to be the guy, like the lone star on a team that, frankly, a lot of these guys are defensive focused, right? Like Kelly Oubre, not a great shooter. He's got some scoring ability, obviously, but when you're asking him to be a primarily catch and shoot guy, that's not really his thing. You know Caleb Martin pretty well from his time in Miami, and I think he's a very good role player, like great fifth starter, or like they brought him off the bench last night. But when he has to scale up and be like a real creator, there are problems there. So if Joel is going to miss all this time, I think that's fine, but that rests on Paul George has got to stay healthy, because they need a genuine, second option or 1A, 1B with Maxey on these nights without Embiid, or you're just asking Tyrese Maxey to have to score 30 plus a night efficiently, and that's tough for anybody in the league to do.
Well, let's talk about that game then, because Tyrese Maxey is the place to start. It is clear that if they are without Joel Embiid and without Paul George in some of these games, that this team is going to struggle to maybe even have a winning record, And yeah. I know that Milwaukee is a better opponent. Everybody's got them in their tiers of contenders. But the way that this thing looked, Tyrese Maxey took, 11 field goal attempts in the first quarter, and he goes 10 for 31 in that game. And there is an issue with Tyrese Maxey having to be the only scorer, because there's just not a lot of offense. And you can look at that shot chart and look at the shots that he was taking, and you're like, man, with Embiid out, this guy just becomes sort of one of these volume shooters. It's very like Cam Thomas-like almost. But then you look at the other side of it and you're like, well, what else is he supposed to do? Because there's nobody else that's really capable of generating offense efficiently and consistently for Philadelphia. And so, Eric Gordon didn't have his best game. He went 1 for 6. Kelly Oubre, like you mentioned, not the kind of a roller coaster ride as a shooter, went 1 for 6 from 3-point range. Caleb Martin only got up 1 3-point attempt, went 5 for 10 overall. There's other guys in this roster that you like. There's enough options here, but those options all look a lot better when they're playing roles and not being asked to carry an offense against a good, relatively good Milwaukee Bucks defense, or a defense that looked pretty good last night at least. And then, of course, against Brook Lopez and Giannis, who caused their own kind of troubles. So, yeah, I don't know what they do if Embiid and Paul George are going to be out for a long time. We only saw Paul George for a couple of preseason games. I know we're still sort of waiting for an update coming out of Sixers practice today, but is there any news on Paul George in terms of when we might be able to see, when is the soonest we might be able to see Paul George? Because they need somebody.
It's not impossible that he'll play Friday night in Toronto. They have not ruled that out quite yet. And as you said, I think we'll probably be getting some news to that effect shortly. I do think, though, because having him available the whole season is such a priority with how they're managing Joel Embiid, they're probably going to play it cautious, right? Like if there's any real risk, they'll say, well, we'll push it back another game. And they're not going to over-index on, if they start 1-2 or whatever it might be in this opening weekend, that's not going to be a reason to abandon kind of their guiding beliefs coming into the year. But you're right. There's a big difference between when Kelly Oubre effectively has to be the second option, and Kelly Oubre when he's the fifth guy, and most of what he's doing is hey, I'm cutting off a ball and Joel Embiid's getting double teamed, and I'm getting an open dunk at the rim, and the game is just simplified to a degree that it can't be. I think one of the things that I saw early, and I'm expecting more of this, is that I think Kyle Lowry will end up playing more in these situations, despite the fact that he's 38, and despite the fact Nick Nurse openly said on media day, his role will probably be smaller this year, just because it's a guy who can run offense, right? And one of the problems for Maxey last night and in these general situations is that you can't tap into him as an off-ball weapon, right? Where you saw early in his career when he played next to James Harden, that's when he was shooting 43, 44% from three, because all you're really asking him to do is relocate, come off screens, maybe sit in the corner, sit on the weak side wing in a lot of cases, and just fire up catch and shoot shots. Well, now when he's the point guard. Or we'll call him the lead guard running the offense. He's taking a lot of pull-up threes. He's taking, tight contested jumpers a lot of the time. And so anything that can make his life easier is where I think they'll go. And so I would imagine we'll see a little bit more of Lowry, even if they probably ideally don't want to have to overwork him either to save him for later in the year.
Yeah, and that's what made the two-man game between Maxey and Joel Embiid so special, is because Embiid was able to run, like, you can run him on a dribble handoff, or
Yeah.
Tyrese Maxey can cut behind the defense while Embiid is in that triple threat spot, and everybody's looking at Embiid, and it just becomes easier for Tyrese Maxey, and he just needs that, right? Like, most guards his size, they need a little bit of help creating their own shot a lot, but Maxey is an efficient shooter. He's got a ton of burst, but when, like the Bucks were last night, just closing off the paint, because nobody's going to help off of KJ Martin, Caleb Martin, Kelly Oubre, like, or nobody's going to be, pushed up against them,
hugging them in
defensively.
the corners.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
You can help off of them. And so it just made Maxey's job. I mean, just some of the shots he was taking was absolutely crazy. And again, if you just did a highlight reel of the shots, you're like, what is wrong with this guy? But then within the context of it, you're like, yeah, of course he had to be taking the shots because there was nothing else there. And it was a real stark contrast, I thought, to watching Milwaukee play basically through the Damian Lillard, Brook Lopez pick and roll. And Brook would set these 30-foot screens, and Dame would just come right off the screen. Drummond or Yabusele would be, kind of playing a little bit back. And as soon as Damian Lillard had a little bit of daylight, he would launch that thing, and he basically carried the Bucks through that third quarter run that won them the game. And you look at Maxey, and he had no such option, right? Like, nobody's like, you're not running Andre Drummond high screen and rolls because nobody cares about defending Drummond. There's no other kind of other option out there. And I did think it was interesting that Nick Nurse was like, I don't know what to do. Put Kyle Lowry out there, and hopefully he could figure out something to do. And even that didn't really work, but I do agree with you that we'll probably see a lot more of that.
Yeah, and I think a couple of my snap takes watching the game were, one, I think that they need to figure out a way to get more shooting on the floor. So you might see Jared McCain, their rookie this year, or maybe earlier than expected, because he's got issues with the on-ball creation and some of the other stuff, but very high pedigree shooter, a guy with a long, successful track record there at the amateur level, and shot relatively well in the preseason. They're already, starting Eric Gordon in an attempt to, which I think that's fraught with a lot of issues, but it's an attempt to try to get some better spacing out there. And like, that's the thing, right? With Maxey, he's got the speed that if you can give him enough space to operate in, he should be able to get to the rim. Not every team is going to have both Brook Lopez and Giannis as like rim protector and the weak side help. And, it won't be as problematic in that respect. The Philadelphia fans will probably say he might get some more calls on other nights. I do think, and for him as a driver too, the one thing that I always pick at with him that I saw last night, he's gotten bigger and he is stronger, but he needs to leverage that more. There needs to be more of like the guy that was great at it that was here, that's now in Miami, was Jimmy Butler, where he's such a physical player, like gets the shoulder into you, but can also sell the contact, like does a great job of like going up under your arms when anybody reaches, like really highlights every reach and every misstep you make. Maybe this is the wrong time to praise Jimmy Butler after he had quite a clunker on night one, but just like learning more of that stuff and leaning more into the physical side of his game, because he's put on quite a bit of weight and quite a bit of muscle. And he's at the point where the refs know who he is, which that's always an important thing as an ascending young player. So I think that will help him out too, right? Because all the great players will go through cold shooting nights. The best ones find a way to like, all right, I'm just going to get myself to the line. I see a couple go in, some cheap free throws, and then that extends out everywhere else. So that'll be a big key for him as well.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting stress test for Maxey when Embiid and Paul George are out, because he's going to have to learn to do all these things that you're talking about, right? Is like, all right, I guess I got to carry the offense now. And it's such a great point. Like, it's a very different thing going against a different kind of defense versus the defense that has Giannis and Brook Lopez just like enveloping all the space as soon as basically it opens up, right? But yeah, you still see Maxey kind of leaning back at contact. And I think the biggest difference with Jimmy Butler is like it's the opposite angle, right? Like when you hit him, he leans right into you. He leans into that contact. And that's really what it takes, I think, to sell these calls. I do want to talk a little bit more about these role players, though, because there was some stuff that I liked.
Yeah.
Um, I thought Caleb Martin brought a real intensity to this team. I am, for some reason, still holding on to Kelly Oubre Jr. stock, thinking that it's going to hit. At this point, it's more of a hold than anything. But he's kind of he's a roller coaster player, right? There's nights where he can maybe win you a game. There's nights where he might get in the way a little bit. I thought it was interesting that Nick Nurse went with KJ Martin to start the first half over Caleb Martin, and then in the second half went with Caleb Martin over KJ Martin. What was that all about?
So KJ had a good preseason, and I think some of it is trying to keep Caleb in the role that maybe Nurse has envisioned when everybody's healthy. And Paul George is in the starting lineup. Eric Gordon is the floor spacer. And one thing he has told the media is that he would like to keep Eric Gordon and Kyle Lowry kind of separate, right? The two older, late 30s guards that got to deal with some defensive concerns there. Although Lowry's a very smart guy, so maybe he could work around those problems. So Caleb coming off of the bench in general, I can sort of squint and see it. When Paul is out, there's no reason that KJ Martin should be starting over Caleb. Like, Caleb is just flat out a better player. And to your point, is just like one of those perfect dirty work guys, right? Like, has 4 offensive rebounds on night one and is always just like popping up in the right places at the right time. I think we've already heard a lot from Kelly Oubre, other guys in the locker room, that Caleb has been a really vocal and active leader, both with his voice and with his actions. The way Kelly put it Wednesday night after the game was, Caleb gets on people a lot, but it's easy to take it from him because he says something either right after he has done it, or he then goes and does it himself, right? So it's one of those, you lead with your voice and you lead by example, which is like my favorite type of role player, right? He's not a guy who's overly obsessed with like, my touches, my shots, my this, but still goes out there, plays super hard, and cares about the right things. So yeah, I really liked what I saw from him. Oubre is, it's Kelly Oubre, right? There are nights when he's going to give you 20 plus, and he's got great talent. Last night, as much as the shot was a problem, defensively it was a little bit of a headless chicken night for him, and that can happen sometimes. I do think he endeared himself last year in a situation where, frankly, it looked like, hey, look, you're on a minimum, dude. You could be on your way out of the league if you don't play well here. And so I'm interested to see how he responds now that he's back on an upward trajectory. He got a little bit of a bigger contract this summer, and frankly has more expectations on him coming into this year. So not my favorite night one for Kelly Oubre, but as you said, he is a roller coaster guy, and presumably once he's in more of that, 4th, 5th guy type of role, I think that's when you'll see all the other stuff be positive for him.
The other guy here is Gershon Yabusele, 4 of 8 in that game. Took 4 3-pointers, which is good. I think he made his first one out of the corner. 4 rebounds, 3 assists, 3 steals. Just sort of all over the place in a good way. And everybody, like, Yabusele, who's not a fan of Yabusele after what we saw in the Olympics. So great that Philadelphia picked him up and gave him a chance in the NBA, because I need to watch more of him. But was also used as the backup 5 during a lot of this game when Andre Drummond was out. And you wrote this in your piece at PHLY, you do the good, bad, and the ugly. And I thought it was a really astute point that you made is, it doesn't work when he's the backup 5, but Philadelphia doesn't really have another option, and it's not necessarily his fault, especially when you're going up against a big team like Milwaukee. So it makes a lot more sense when you have Joel Embiid there, when you have Embiid, and then Drummond's the backup. But it does feel like there's still, as great of a pickup as Andre Drummond was, and he was pretty good in this game too, in terms, and especially on the boards. As great as a pickup as Drummond was as the backup center, you almost need the backup to the backup now, because Embiid isn't going to be playing a lot of games.
Yeah, I'm sort of looking way ahead at this point and saying I think they probably acquire another big at some point this season. That doesn't need to be like a big name guy or anything, but when you're asking a 6'7", 6'8" forward to be your backup center on non-Embiid nights, and we're already sitting here saying, like, well, Joel might play 55, 60 games. That's a lot of games. That's like a quarter of the season. You're saying we need somebody else to man that position behind Drummond. And I have really liked what I've seen from Yabusele overall, right? And I think you can tell, I think, that he has played in Europe for a long time, because it's a lot of the like ball doesn't stick, and he doesn't stick either. Like, you look at the guy and he's just like this big bruiser looking dude. And if he just sat in the dunker spot, that'd be like, yeah, that's what I expect that guy to do. But he's been very proactive with, sliding around on the perimeter, making cuts, setting constant screens, doing all that. So I think once he can play next to Embiid and be in that type of setup, I think he will really start to shine. Certainly, as you pointed out, in the Olympics when he's playing next to Wemby or Gobert or another big, and when he was at Real Madrid playing next to guys like Tavares, you saw that, like, shot 40% from three, great hustle player. The playmaking was pretty good for a guy at that position. But right now, it's just, and Nick Nurse admitted this last night after the game, he's like, it's just kind of what we have to do right now. It's not necessarily that we want to play him as a five, but Adem Bona, who's their only other big, he is a super raw second round pick. Like, I think long-term, like, good project player to have, and he's going to get a lot of time in the G League, but you can tell, like, they just don't trust him yet and probably shouldn't. So they got to figure something out there.
I will say there's a couple of things that I do like from that opening night that makes me feel good about this team. If and when we finally, well, not if, I guess, when we finally see Embiid and Paul George all together, it feels like all this kind of can click into place. 17 offensive rebounds. This team might lead the league in offensive rebounds. They are crashing the glass. What is it that they crash rate is like the big buzzword? Like, they are doing it. And that's going to be huge in terms of creating those extra chance opportunities, obviously. And then, I did like the hustle. Like, it was an inefficient night from Kelly Oubre. It wasn't Caleb Martin's best night, but like, there's a lot of, and then the Yabusele stuff that we were talking about, but there's just guys who are going to do some of the hard work and really hustle and just make stuff happen. And that, to me, is such an underrated NBA skill, is just doing stuff. And there's just a lot of NBA players that don't do stuff. And I just feel like this roster has a lot of guys who just do stuff. Oubre, KJ Martin, Caleb Martin, Yabusele, Andre Drummond. Like, they're just like, they're frenetic. They're all over the place. And I do think when you have a structure in place of Joel Embiid and Paul George and Tyrese Maxey as your big three, all that stuff, it just feels like it makes such a greater impact when they're doing it on that sort of like foundation of, all right, we have the stars that are handling the scoring, anchoring the defense, etc. We can kind of just fill in the cracks.
Yeah, and I think what struck me last night is it almost seemed like Milwaukee was going off of last year's scout, where the Sixers were not a particularly good rebounding team on either end. And Giannis was just kind of head in the clouds for the first, 5 to 7 minutes of that game. And they were just getting punished on the glass. Like, Drummond, KJ Martin, Caleb Martin, just coming from every which way to create these extra possessions. I mean, the Sixers, I think, had 18 more shot attempts than the Bucks last night and still lost pretty handily. If you get a good shooting night, that potentially swings the exact other way. And so I think the big thing I've been trying to tell Sixers fans, and they know this already throughout the offseason, was this is the first time really in my lifetime the Sixers have had three wings that are playable at any given time. Like, three guys between George, Martin, Oubre, and then you have like KJ Martin and Ricky Council the fourth on the bench, who are at least like, they're like interesting-ish young players, right? And they're both very good athletes. This is the first time you've had a lot of athletes on the team. And Nick Nurse has shown throughout his career, when he has guys like this, he's empowering them. He's like, they want to chase extra possessions at basically every opportunity. So that means offensive rebounding. That means playing pretty aggressively on defense. Like, we haven't gotten to see that necessarily yet, because without Joel Embiid as the rim protector back there, you're not going to feel as empowered to say, hey, Kelly, hey, Caleb, or even Paul, get out in the passing lanes and take risks, because you have that guy waiting back there if all goes wrong. So I think that's going to be another thing to watch as we see, how this roster comes together. But I agree with you. I was considering they lost by 16, 17, whatever it was. I was pretty impressed with the fight
Right.
overall, and it just was one of those where it's like, yeah, they shot like crap, and you can tell that they need their offensive weapons. But I think the spine of this team and kind of the personality of a lot of these guys will keep them in a lot of games throughout the season.
Kyle Neubeck does great work at PHLY Sports. Kyle, thanks so much for jumping on, man. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. The basketball season is finally here, and Game Time is a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier. Game Time Picks filters out all the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. There's so many ways to save money on tickets no matter when you buy. Game Time Picks shows you only the best values on tickets. Game Time has last-minute deals on tickets right up to the start of the event, even an hour after it starts. They have exclusive flash deals and sponsored deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. They have zone deals where you pick the section and Game Time picks the seats for big savings. And by toggling on all-in pricing, you see the total upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code CLNS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code CLNS for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. Keith Smith from Spotrac and the NBA front office show is here now to help me go through some of these contract extensions. And I think we got to start with the Rockets because I think some of these were the most surprising, Keith. We have Alperen Şengün signing 5 years, $185 million, and then Jalen Green, 3 years, $106 million, a player option in that third year, a 10% trade kicker, which I think is going to be important in terms of what this contract means for the Houston Rockets. But let's start with Şengün, though, first. What did you make of the Rockets being able to get this guy on this kind of deal?
Yeah, I was a little surprised. I thought Houston may go the Philadelphia-ish path of keep the guy with the low cap hold, create a bunch of cap space, and move forward that way. That was a little more complicated for them because that would have meant we got to move on from Fred VanVleet. That's obviously not something they want to do. As an aside, I still think there's a chance we see VanVleet opt out or they opt VanVleet out next year, but then sign him to a long-term deal that spreads the money out a little bit. I know we're going to talk about Rudy Gobert, but like a kind of a cousin to what happened with Gobert and his extension. But with Şengün, there's two really interesting parts to this. One, 5-year extension with the player option. Those have become extremely rare for rookie scale deals. The last two guys who got them, Jason Tatum and Donovan Mitchell, who got them when they were already established all-stars. So that part's a little bit odd, but also the fact that it's a non-max deal. So that kind of tells me, I'm guessing the Rockets said, hey, will you take this much money? And Şengün's side said, we'd like a max with a player option. And then they said, well, how about we do our money, but we give you the player option, and that's the middle ground. So I'm a big fan of Şengün as a player. I'm a big fan of the contract. I think it'll be, really good, for him and the Rockets both, but it definitely a surprising one, the way it ended up structured.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the people that were in Şengün's draft class too, and you could argue, that he might be the most productive player in that class so far through his career, right? I mean, it's Cade Cunningham, Jalen Green, obviously, who's on his team, Evan Mobley, Scotty Barnes, Jalen Suggs. A lot of these guys signed deals. Franz Wagner is also part of that class. And then you had Şengün picked in the middle of the first round and ended up being a huge hit for the Rockets. So to get him, I think if you're a Rockets fan, you're like, wow, we got this guy at, an average annual value of $37 million, whatever the math comes out to. And you look at that compared to somebody like even like Cade Cunningham, who, is sort of the cornerstone of the Detroit Pistons rebuild here, making a lot more money than Şengün is on these rookie contract extensions. Even Franz Wagner, who's basically a max at this point. And that feels like a pretty good deal for Houston. Now, is Şengün somebody that you're going to build the whole franchise around? I think there's still questions about that. But in terms of what he's been able to do and what he's been able to prove, I mean, he's as proven as any of these other guys in his class.
Yeah, completely agree. I think the one guy I would probably say put a little ahead is Scotty Barnes, but that's just because he's already made an all-star team. But one other differentiator too, because this is not a max deal, that also means there's no language in there that if Şengün makes All NBA, that he escalates to higher than a 25% of the cap max, which that's something that Cunningham got, Mobley got, Wagner got, and Barnes got. So, and I don't know that it's crazy to say Alperen Şengün makes all NBA, especially if the 65 game rule comes into play. And we did see last year, even in the new positionless voting, a lot of voters still did the traditional like center, 2 forwards, two guards. Maybe they mixed the forwards and guards a bit, but almost everybody still voted 3 centerish guys across the team. So I don't know that it's insane to say he makes that. And I just pulled it to make sure I had the numbers right. Over the life of this contract, he's going to be sitting at 20% of the cap ish amount there. So that just gives you a sense as we project the cap to go up. This will look even better as a non-max extension for the Rockets as it goes. So I think this is wonderful for Houston. And then I think for Şengün, the win is obviously gets that player option and he'll get back out onto the market when he has a chance to cash in on one more big deal, likely in his career.
So there's a lot to go into this, right? I mean, you mentioned the fact that, all right, by doing this deal now with Şengün, it kind of takes them out of the free agency market or limits their flexibility in terms of getting on the free agency market next summer. But at the same time, that long-term flexibility of locking this guy into what could end up being a below average or below market deal, because if Şengün goes out and makes all-star, all-NBA this year, he would have been, I mean, we're talking about a max guy if he didn't have a contract next summer. And so you kind of lock him into a better deal. The flip side of that, too, is this Jalen Green contract, which is fascinating. So let's just jump into it. I mean, if this Şengün deal could look like one of the best bargains in the NBA, this Jalen Green contract could go either direction, right? Like if he ends up being the star, he's like, wow, they got this guy at $30 million a year. But to say this guy has been worth $30 million a year so far in his career would be crazy. I mean, maybe a third of that based on his on-court production. I mean, it's been a pretty rocky start to Jalen Green's career, very up and down. But and correct me if I'm wrong right now. So by doing this, because he was a top 5 pick, his cap hold next year would have been basically the same as what the contract is going to be. So it doesn't really impact Houston's flexibility on the free agent market next summer, but they're locked into a really interesting contract right now.
Yeah, this one by itself doesn't really change much for the Rockets. It's the combination of him and Şengün that basically says, all right, they're not going the cap space route. They're going to keep their guys, barring some really unexpected trades over the next few months here ahead of the trade deadline. So I think the one challenge with the Rockets with Jalen Green becomes and this is a point Seth Partnow, I think, was making on Twitter like as this was playing out, was how do you win this if you're the Rockets? And I think, and maybe I'm putting words in his mouth, so I'll say it. In my opinion, the challenge becomes if Green pops and is awesome, well, he'll opt out in 2 years, and then you're going to have to re-sign him on a team where now you have, as much as Şengün's on a good value contract, you've got him. You're going to have re-signed Jabari Smith Jr. You're going to have to re-sign Tyrese. You're going to have what other veterans you have in place. And that's going to be a challenge. If he's not good, let's say he reverts to the Jalen Green of most of his career, now you're kind of stuck with it because he'll just opt in for $36 million, and then you're stuck with a contract that doesn't look so good. So it's a super interesting structure. I think it was Brian Windhorst pointed out that like this looks like it was designed as a tradable contract, and I think there's definitely truth in that. I think there's a world where with the scenario I played out doesn't end up mattering for the Rockets because he won't be there in a couple years, and a lot of that's going to depend on how do Reed Shepherd and Amin Thompson develop? Like, well, what do they turn into? If those guys really develop, well, now do you need Jalen Green? Like, what? Yeah, where are we headed with that? But this is Jalen Green in March of last season earned this contract because it was like you can play normal winning basketball on a good team, not just this run up and down, throw up crazy stuff like he did the entirety of his first 2 years, where it looked like me and you got 3 friends and played pickup in NBA games. And just, I jokingly said you were as likely to see a great play as you were to see some lady get beamed in the head with the ball 8 rows deep in the stands because they were just all over the place. And Green was a big part of that.
I hate this contract, and I hate this for the Houston Rockets. And I was gonna kind of get into this and be like, talk me into this, Keith. And it doesn't sound like you're gonna be able to.
Yeah, it's hard.
It's difficult, and I agree. Like, how does this work out? And I know that, CAA, who represents Jalen Green, is out here being like, there's never been a contract ever signed like this before, and all these things. It's like, all right, cool. There's a reason for that, because your client isn't worth the max, and because I guess Houston looked at this and they're like, I don't know, $30 million. We got the player option on that third. It's only 3 years. I don't know. Screw it. Let's just do it. And that 10% trade kicker is the interesting part to me too, because it feels like that's built for Jalen Green to get traded. But that's a good thing for him. I think that makes it maybe more difficult to trade him, and even if you wanted to potentially. So it's a weird contract. It's hard for this to work out. And yeah, he had that great run in March, but we know this. Like, March basketball is very different than the larger sample size of an entire career. And when I'm making a huge financial decision like this with a Houston Rockets team who's everybody loves this young core, but when you have a great young core, it makes these decisions even more important, because you could screw it up and be like, oh my God, well, now we can't get off of Jalen Green. Now we have to trade one of the good guys that we like maybe 2 years down the road. And now you're kind of resetting things. So I don't really know why. I wish the Rockets would have just said, you know what? If Jalen Green pops this year and he ends up being worth $40 million a year, fine. That's great. Like, to me, if I'm the Rockets, I'm kind of rooting for that. But I just can't really figure out why they did this, other than it's sort of the 11th hour. It's right before the deadline. CAA kind of maybe said, you know what? We'll do it for 30 with the player option on the third, and throw that trade kicker in there. And then maybe the Houston was just like, we don't have enough time to really think about it. Yes. I don't know. I have no idea why they would have done this. I think it was an awful decision.
Yeah, I think the challenge is you removed all of your own leverage, because what you would have kind of hung over his head was the specter of restricted free agency of, hey, even if let's say he came out and it was like, holy crap, this dude's an all-star now and everything else, fine. Even if the Brooklyn Nets, the only team with meaningful cap space, parachute in with a monster offer sheet for you, we'll just match it, because it is what it is. Yeah, you would have got the player option in year 4, because that's how it would have been structured if it got to an offer sheet. And we'll talk about that maybe with a couple guys who didn't extend. But it is, you did it anyway. You gave him a player option a year earlier. So it's just a weird structure. It's kind of, I look at a Rockets team that, as they've rebuilt in the wake of trading James Harden, has kind of nailed every step along the way. Like, they hit on their draft picks. They got the right kind of guys there. They added really smart veteran signings. Yeah, did they overpay a couple guys? Sure. But you have to when you're a rebuilding team. And they didn't overpay them on super long-term deals that are impossible to work around. But now this was the one where, you got Şengün on such a sweetheart extension that looks great. And then this was just a little weird. And that feels like, all right, if this is your one misstep, I'm not going to make a huge deal of it. I wonder if they're looking at it and saying, hey, in 2 years, if he opts out, we may be like, cool, man, we got Reed Shepherd, we got Thompson.
Right.
They're ready to step in and go as our backcourt. You're out. Van Vliet's transitioned into a third guard role. And we're going to invest that money elsewhere on the roster to improve around what will at that point likely be a Şengün fully led team. So we'll see. I'm with you. It's definitely one of the odder decisions that was made here in the last couple weeks.
Not a death knell to the rebuild at all, to your point, right? Like, there's ways it's still a relatively cheap roster. You don't have to pay all the other young guys yet, but it just feels like a thing. Like, a year from now, we're going to be talking about, how do the Rockets deal with this Jalen Green contract? It's like one of those contracts that are signed immediately, and you're like, that doesn't look great anymore. On the other side of it, and I think this is what you were referencing, the Warriors, fascinating stuff. So they signed Moses Moody, 3-year, $39 million rookie scale contract extension. Awesome, good for them, tidy business. Move that along. The interesting part with what the Warriors didn't do was with Jonathan Kuminga. Jonathan Kuminga made it very clear he wants a max contract. Him and his representation believe that he's capable of being a max player, and that's what he wanted. The Warriors were clearly not going to go there, because they're still not really sure what Jonathan Kuminga is as a player, kind of how the Rockets were with Jalen Green. And yet here are the Warriors standing pat, not doing anything. They did not sign him to an extension. Kuminga will be a restricted free agent next summer. And I thought that was really smart, even as risky as it might be for the Warriors. I think it was smart. It's what I wish Houston would have done with Jalen Green. I think there's value in just saying, you know what, we don't really know what to do here, and cap space and how we use our money is so crucial in this new second apron world that we're just going to stand pat. We're not going to worry about it. Maybe a little bit of like Jordan Poole buyer's remorse seeped into this, like where they're like, you know what, we already did this once, it didn't work out. What did you think about the Warriors not doing anything on Kuminga?
Yeah, it's that last part where I think that ties in. I think there's also, we just dug out of like what was going to be years of second apron challenges. Like, let's not immediately jump right back in with both feet by handing out a max deal here to a guy who is, in my opinion, in a vacuum, I would have given Kuminga the max and not thought too much about it. He's less proven than guys like Barnes, Mobley, or Wagner, who I think are kind of his comps in the class. But I think you saw it last year. Like, it was not just, oh, well, he got way more minutes. He did get more minutes, but it wasn't just that. He got more efficient. He cut down on some of the contested stuff. Really played really, really well. And I'm very, very high
good on ball
Jonathan.
Defender.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, he's kind of got everything you want in like a combo forward, right? He's got that size. I'm a little turned off by the whole I'm a small forward thing. Like, who cares, man? Like, it doesn't really matter. Like, you're a forward. Like, this is 2024. There's very few power forwards and small forwards now. You're either a big or you're like a combo forward or a wing, and you're like a combo forward. But whatever.
Hey, good for him though. The Warriors are playing him at small forward now.
That's it. Yeah, they are, with
Draymond
Andrew Wiggins
Chase,
shoehorned in as a giant two guard, which, I mean, it worked, but they also played Portland and destroyed a pretty woeful Blazers team opening night. But yeah, I get why the Warriors held. This is one where if I could jump in my time machine and get to June, July, we're starting free agency. I think Sean Marks is sitting there, but he might already have that offer sheet typed out, ready to go. We've seen him do it before, right? Where it's like, hey, how I'm going to try to do this is I'll throw out offer sheets, because if we land the guy, awesome. If we don't, what did we tie up cap space for? It's not like we missed out on anything else. We'll just move on to the next guy. And that's where I do wonder if the Warriors are going to get forced into giving him a max deal that then is a little more advantageous to his side than maybe to theirs, because it's only going to be like a 3+1, because that's what the offer sheet will come in at. But it's not the end of the world. They'll figure it out. And this gives you a little bit more time to see, all right, hey, yeah, maybe there is a Wiggins trade that materializes over the course of the year, and they move off him and they don't take on a bunch of long-term salary in that. And then it's like, all right, you know what? Now we feel better about giving Kuminga a big contract right away. Because remember, the important thing, you can now negotiate with your own guys the day after the NBA Finals. So that's huge, because they'll have that window before anybody else can. Because let's face it, we all know no one would ever talk to anyone early to get any sense of, what offers might be there. Right. Should you wait until the legal talking period? Like, but it's that is a little bit of an advantage, at least, hey, we can get this done right now with you on a deal, and we don't even have to play the game of restricted free agency in a couple more weeks.
So speaking of flexibility here, I think it also opens up the flexibility to trade Jonathan Kuminga before the trade deadline. Also, we know that the Warriors had they signed him the extension, obviously that gets a lot more complicated. So the Warriors have been out here. I mean, there was a story written in The Athletic the other day about it. They were chasing Lauri Markkanen and chasing Paul George, thinking that perhaps they can even get both of those guys. It's not been a secret that they're looking at the Lakers and saying, like, LeBron, is he going to stay there forever if he ever wants to pair with Steph? Like, they've been doing everything just short of tampering in terms of publicly trying to say, LeBron, you'd be welcome in San Francisco. They're going to be aggressive. They're going to be very aggressive between now and February. That much has been made very clear. And so Kuminga is their best trade chip. Had they signed him to the extension, I do think that complicates it. And of course, I think Mike Dunleavy and the rest of this front office had to be thinking about that when they were looking at the possibility of Jonathan Kuminga signing him to an extension. Now, my question is, if Kuminga's representation came to the Warriors and said, we'll do the Jalen Green deal, $30 million a year, player option, 3 years, short term, I wonder what the Warriors would have said then. Because they might have just done what Houston did, throw their hands up and just say, you know what, let's just do this anyway. I don't know. Maybe they would have prioritized the flexibility.
Yeah, I kind of hoped they wouldn't have and said,
Same.
you know what, they're probably not going to say this to his reps and him, but I think internally when they sit down and say, let us talk about it, I think they look at each other and say, we'd rather have him as a trade chip because Jalen Green is, to go back to him, he's functionally untradeable right
Yeah.
now in the moment because what happens on these rookie scale deals is the poison pill provision kicks in. So you count as one salary on the outgoing side, but the incoming side for the team acquiring, you count at way more. It's usually double or triple the amount, and that becomes a challenge, right? Is man, like it's very very hard. You almost have to pull in a third team that has either exceptions or cap space to make it work, and that can be very difficult. So if I was the Warriors, I would have said, "Nah, we're not interested in that. It's either going to be a long-term deal." More like Shingun's, where it's not quite the max, and we see a little bit of savings on this, or let's let it play out. Let's see what it looks like in July, after we've had a long season and one more year of, are you do it again or even better? Yeah, then we're happy to give you the deal ourselves. But yeah, that was one of the more interesting ones that didn't get done.
Today's episode of Real GM Radio is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. Prize Picks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Unlike other apps, on Prize Picks, it's just you against the numbers. All you do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. Prize Picks is the best way to get action on sports in most states, including California, Texas, and Georgia. Prize Picks is the only real money daily fantasy platform with an injury insurance policy so that your lineup stays in play even if one of your players gets injured. If your player leaves in the first half and doesn't return, with Prize Picks, your picks are still alive. Prize Picks puts their members first, so all withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure. When my pick hits, I get my money in as quick as 15 minutes. Prize Picks invented the flex play, which means you could still cash out if your lineup isn't perfect. You can double your money even if one of your picks doesn't hit. Download the Prize Picks app today and use the code CLNS and get $50 instantly when you play $5. That's code CLNS on Prize Picks to get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. Prize Picks. Run your game. So I got 4 more for you here, and you just tell me which one's most interesting or the one that you feel like talking about right now. We've got Jalen Johnson and the Hawks agreeing to a 5-year, $150 million deal. Trey Murphy, 4 years, $112 million with New Orleans. Jalen Suggs and the Magic, 5 years, $150.5 million. And then Corey Kispert with the Wizards, 4 years and $54 million. Which one of those do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I think Jalen Suggs, because I think Murphy and Johnson those are kind of, yeah, makes sense, right? There's just not much there to dig into. And then with Corey Kispert, a couple people are like, what a ridiculous overpay. And that tells me, nah, no one's watching the Wizards that isn't a Wizards fan over the last couple of years because he's good. He gets tagged with he's just a white shooter, right? And he's not that. He is that, but he's that plus. He can do some stuff off the dribble. Exactly. Yeah, plays with a headband. Yeah, he's got a little funk to his game. He's fun. But Jalen Suggs, typical Magic, right? They got creative with this. They front loaded the contract, loaded it up. It was initially reported as having a team option. It does not have a team option on the final year with this, which that part is a little surprising. Orlando loves their team options, but front loading it. And why to me that is so important is you have Franz on a max now. Everybody knows they signed Caldwell Pope, but then they also re-signed everybody else that were their own free agents pretty much except for Markelle Fultz. And then Paolo next summer is going to sign his max extension, which that's probably, I'm guessing, going to be a super max, the 30%, because that's going to jump up because he's going to be an all-NBA guy. So when they'll have him and Franz on a max, a bunch of other guys signed, as those contracts go up, Suggs is going the other way. And the important thing is those descending contracts are great as long as the last year you can still extend the player off of that last year at a number that makes sense for them. If you go too low, that's when it turns into guys like you and I are like, well, he's not going to extend because there's just not enough money. So he's going to free agency. And that's where that enters a bit of unknownness here. The number's still high enough for Suggs at the end where you're still talking, you're going to get him in the range of 35 35 to 40 million, and that should be enough to take care of him.
I love that the Magic got this done. It was a little, I was kind of, it was giving me a little bit of anxiety. I'm like, are they going to get this
Yeah.
done? Because to me, Jalen Suggs is so fundamentally important to what it is that they do. He's not their best player, but you could argue in terms of their identity, maybe their most important player. I mean, everything the Orlando Magic is doing is built on defense, and not just defense, like hard-nosed, up in your grill defense. Like, I am going to bother you and you are going to hate playing us defense. And Jalen Suggs, again, not their best player, and I'm not. And what I'm saying right now isn't like not the most valuable thing in the league, but I think maybe the hardest thing in the league to find is a guard who can defend his position at an elite level. There's just not a lot of these guys. It's like Drew Holiday, Caruso, Suggs, like end of list. Maybe there's a couple maybe
Derek
other
White,
guys.
I would throw
Derek
in
White,
there
yeah,
too.
sure, other guys too. But like it's not a long list, and it's really hard to find these guys. And so had they let him enter restricted free agency next year, I was like, somebody's gonna like. There's a contender that's gonna pay this guy. Like somebody's gonna pay this guy. And especially when you look at the success that the Celtics have had with guys just like Jalen Suggs, I think you would have had a copycat scenario potentially happening there. But I'm glad that the Magic got this done, and you already outlined the stuff with the contract, how it descends and all that stuff. It gives them a little bit of flexibility, but don't trade Jalen Suggs, Orlando. He's really good. Don't trade him. Don't trade him.
Yeah, I don't think they're. Yeah, he's not going anywhere. I would say too. Another thing is he fits perfectly with Paolo and Franz as a combo guard. He's got just enough playmaking juice himself. He can bring the ball up the floor and set kind of the offense, then pitch it off to them and then go do whatever he's going to do. And then there's moments when it's because they play very few meaningful minutes without Paolo or Franz on the court. He can be the second guy who not necessarily like, oh my gosh, they've got this three-headed monster, but just another guy who can get you shots. He showed a lot more on ball creation. And then the shooting. If the shooting jump is real, well, then this is a definite no-brainer. I look at it as I think Orlando, in a lot of ways, is building in the mold of what Boston did, which is we're going to have two big playmaking wings that can do a lot of different stuff, including be our primary scorers. Then we're going to have guards who fit around them and play defense and can make shots there. And then we're going to really, because they're really tasking Wendell Carter, shoot 3-pointers. We want you to shoot them. If you're open, take them. And I think they're really trying to grow into what Boston was with a team it's the Celtics now, especially after the ridiculous shooting on opening night. Everybody's like, their offense is just a machine, but at their base, they are still a defensive team that is just a mess to play against. And we saw that with Orlando. They had Miami completely stifled.
Oh yeah.
The Heat, it was like, that third quarter, there was moments where it's like, well, we're done. Like, we don't have an answer for any of what they're doing, because anytime, all right, we picked out the guard on the switch, and now the guard's up in my face 30 feet, and I can't even put the ball on the floor. So it doesn't matter that I have 4 inches on him. I can't get to where I need to get to get a good shot. It was like that. I think Orlando, the other part where Boston, like, lock up our guys. If we've got guys who we like that fit and are good, we're going to lock them up. And but we're going to lock them up to contracts. They're all reasonable. So if we need to move one later, we'll move one later. I mean, they're just like the Celtics 2 years behind, 3 years behind, I guess, is especially on the salary sheet, because they're not going to pay $500 million in salary and tax penalties. Not probably anytime, but definitely not anytime soon.
Yeah, I wrote about the Celtics Magic comp the other day, and it's a great comparison. It makes a lot of sense to just look at how they're built and everything like that. I love the fact that they're stress testing Paolo and Franz. They said, hey, we're not going to go out and get Anthony Simons, Malik Monk, or like a ball handler that's going to take. We actually need you to go through these hard times and become a better playmaker, because that's how we're going to become a better team. That's how we're going to reach our ceiling, even if we're not going to be necessarily as good as maybe we could have been had we made some other offseason moves. Jalen Suggs, you already mentioned the shooting. 40% from 3 last year. I still don't think anybody trusts him to make a three-pointer if their life was dependent on it. He still needs to prove that. But defensively, I was in the arena for the Heat season opener, and what Jalen Suggs did to Terry Rozier, I mean, he should be arrested for assault. Like, it was crazy what that guy did. I mean, he's going to be first-team all-defense probably for a few times in his career. He's awesome. I'm a big Jalen Suggs fan, if that has not been made clear already. 2 more non-rookie contracts that we have to discuss here. Aaron Gordon, picks up his player option for next season at $22-ish million, and then extends off that 3 years, $103.6 million. And then we have Rudy Gobert, 3 years, $110 million. Opposite, he turns down the $47 million player option for next year. So that's going to save Minnesota about $12-ish million next year. It locks Gobert, who's 32 years old, into a good deal through his age 35 season. Let's start with Gordon, I guess. I'm really more interested in the Gobert part, but Aaron Gordon, is there anything I'm missing there other than, hey, good deal for everybody all around?
No, I don't think so. I think he has proven to be a dream fit as someone who watched every game he played here in Orlando in person. It still is like, there's still a little bit of me like, man, I wish this could have happened for the Magic with him. It worked out obviously well for all parties involved, but the difference was they don't have Nikola Jokic, right? And
Right.
Gordon has proven to be the ideal front court partner. And I think what some people missed is last season, he kind of morphed into their backup center too.
Mm-hmm.
He played about 10, 15% of his minutes, depending on which tracking you like to use there. But he really, that was kind of his role quite a bit, as they didn't have anybody they were comfortable with. And I think that's going to be increasingly important for them, especially as you look at some of these teams in the West, being able to just, all right, we got Jokic for his 35 minutes when we need it. We can plug Gordon in for 15 minutes and we're fine. Like we're good at the center spot, even if, Dario Saric doesn't work out, or insert, whoever, Deron Holmes, when he's healthy next season. And even if those guys aren't quite what we need them to be, we're okay with that. And that's a sneaky part of this. But yeah, he's really good. And it's always good to have guys, again, we've said this about a couple other players, guys who just know what their role is. Like my role is to play defense, run the floor, rebound, not really complain if I don't get a bunch of shots and touches. I just got to do my thing. And that's so huge when you have already three primary on-ball scorers, playmakers in Jokic, Murray, and Porter. You just need an elite role player, and that's what Aaron Gordon is.
Yeah, I said after they signed Jamal Murray to that max, you're paying for the chemistry more than the player, even though Jamal Murray is a good player. Aaron Gordon, obviously a very good player. His chemistry with Jokic is also very under-discussed because we always focus on the Jamal Murray-Jokic two-man game, but what Aaron Gordon has developed in terms of the lob game and all that kind of stuff it's right up there with what Jokic and Murray has developed. And now between these two deals, Aaron Gordon and Rudy Gobert, they kind of both, they feel to me like the final scene in a movie where the movie's kind of all over the place and you're like, I don't really know what's the plot? Like, what are we really talking about here? And then the final scene kind of everything clicks into place and you're like, oh, that's what this movie is about. That's what they were trying to tell me. Both of these deals with Aaron Gordon and Rudy Gobert, it kind of makes the whole offseason for Denver and for Minnesota click into place a little bit. Like, oh, I get it. That was the end goal. So with the Nuggets, obviously they let Kentavious Caldwell-Pope walk. They got a lot of flack for that. The talent drain over the last couple of years has been well documented. But with locking in Aaron Gordon here for this contract, you say, okay, they got Murray, they got Gordon, they already had Michael Porter Jr. under contract. Jokic is obviously under contract. No matter what, and the Celtics are even going to face this in a year. There's going to become a time where they were going to have to let one of these guys go, and they looked at everything that was in front of them, and they said, KCP, you're the weak link. I'm sorry. And so they ended up going with these guys, and now there's still some other things that they got to do, and maybe they could have waited a year and signed KCP. I don't know, but not necessarily to defend letting KCP walk, but this is at least makes it look like it makes sense. And then with Gobert, it's very similar, right? Basically, the Timberwolves decided between Gobert and Karl-Anthony Towns. They decided with Gobert. So they trade Karl-Anthony Towns, and then a week later, they lock Gobert into this deal, which probably not going to look great in the last year of this contract, maybe even like the second to last year of this contract. But the Minnesota is also saying, we don't really care. The cap is going up. He's making $12 million less than he was going to make next year. That takes us below the second apron, I believe, maybe the first apron.
It'll be close once they fill out their roster.
So it gives them a little bit more flexibility than they otherwise would have had. And to me, now the Timberwolves, with all the things that they've done last week, are thoroughly set on course in the Anthony Edwards window. Like everything they did, they said, okay, the Karl-Anthony Towns era is gone. The Anthony Edwards era is here. This is what we're doing.
Yeah, I completely agree. Now, there was a world where when the trade process, I'm sitting there looking at the cap sheet and I'm like, man, we could be like is crazy expensive as they are right now, we could be like a year out from Minnesota has a ton of flexibility, and it's like Edwards, McDaniels, and not much else on the books, but they went a slightly different way. I think Julius Randle, they're very much going to do the wait and see approach. If it works out really well, okay, then we're willing to talk a new deal with you. We'll figure that out. But with Gobert, they know it can work. And as much flack as the guy gets, I've never quite really figured out why everybody hates him so much. It's just, I don't, it's weird. I think maybe the over the topness of the Jazz fans led to that to some extent. But when I look at Gobert, at the very least, for beyond this season, 2 more years, you're going to get elite level rim protection and rebounding. And then that last year, that might be real ugly, but then he's an expiring contract and you could probably flip him in another trade and figure it out. But to your point, knocking 12 million off just his number alone, let's say they do, for whatever reason, end up being roughly around as expensive as they are for everybody else on the roster. It's actually going to save them in terms of real dollars, like 70 to 80 million, because they're at like a 6 to 7 times multiplier on the tax, because that's how far over they are. So just a massive savings there. And this is one of the things I kept kind of hammering home was, unless there's a thought of like Gobert and Randall come off the books either next year or the year after, and then really retool around Edwards, McDaniels, and crew, there's a world where the Wolves, this is what you do. You let the player opt out, but then you say, all right, we're going to take care of you longer term. We're going to turn your 40 million in this case, I kept saying 90, but into 100, but over 3 years where none of those numbers is a killer, and off we go. This is similar to kind of what I mentioned with Fred VanVleet. I think you opt him out, you turn his 40 million, we'll turn it into 90 or 100 million, but over 3 years, and your number's a lot more palatable, and we can fit it into our cap sheet a lot easier. This is just good work by the Wolves, and remains to be seen, was the Towns trade the right move or not? We won't know that for several months yet, but hey, I think they're all in on this is Ant's team, and we're doing everything we can to hand it to him and go. And that's hard to say that's the wrong decision.
Appreciate the time, man. Thanks for jumping on.
Thanks for having me.